I was I was born 2 years after Ubu, so I was born into the world of Ubu, um, but perhaps wasn't very aware of it. I feel like Ubu comes out of the technology behind Ubu comes out of a certain hacker ethos, kind of people well aware of what the internet signified, and people who are associated to the kind of original plan of the internet, a plan of decentralized servers that talk to each other independently, that depended a lot on protocols, and that these protocols were forms of guaranteeing relative autonomy between these units. And Ubu is the kind of expansion of that initial, let's call it hacker avant-garde, into a kind of artistic avant-garde. Um, this connection happens fruitfully, and it happens because certain artists are well aware of what's happening in the world. But it only would take another decade after Ubu starts for it to become kind of mainstream media, for the internet to be the place which takes over journalism and distribution of films and videos and movies and streaming. And so you have this kind of intermediate post-avant-garde but early blog sphere space, which also still predates me. When the blog sphere is happening, I'm 10 and I'm playing Pokemon. So on my Game Boy Advance SP, small blue version I got when I was 8. So that's 2006. So the kind of origins of Ubu, they kind of signify the beginning of metonymically of the internet, but also of a kind of independent voices speaking, independent publishing that does not depend on a massive platform in order to be done. You no longer need to study to go to journalism school to have access to the people who are the ones who have this network of distribution. And the kind of the last 25 years have been progressively people realizing that this technology can be used for those old purposes and being reappropriated by these larger systems. So for me, the internet, particularly after college, and particularly through sources such as Ubu and online wikis and forums and platforms that retain some of the original ethos of the internet, have been places where I find mostly theoretical discussions that are kind of resurfacing the origin of the internet. So it's funny that kind of Ubu's 25 years, it comes with the kind of happiness of this way of thinking of producing culture and knowledge, the kind of death of it in the mainstream, and then the kind of resurfacing of possibility. For me, these kind of online platforms, for me nowadays it's associated to sort of media wiki forums that are made for particular small communities, and then kind of these avant-garde archives that for me are kind of references for an alternative past, or a past that's more interesting, that lets me look forward in the future, but particularly futures that are predicated on this original history of the internet, which feels gone and feels like everything is being conspired for it to not happen. It also feels like an alternative history to kind of what I'm taught in kind of mainstream university, not because the university is necessarily a regressive institution, but because these are still avant-garde movements. This has not been fully folded into what is a kind of core curriculum of the university. And so when you start looking for interesting things, you always end up somewhere on the internet in some hole. I feel like there's a kind of fracturing of the internet space. There's no longer kind of a post-globalization unit of humanity that consumes uniform media. And you perceive this as the creation of micro networks, no longer the social network Facebook, which has 2 billion, 3 billion users, but you have small Discord groups or small sub-forums on Reddit or one of these platforms, which speak a kind of internal language. They have their own vocabulary, and they have their own past and their own history, and they find these pasts and histories throughout the internet. And so there's a lot of stuff. There's no longer a kind of one path through. There's a lot of theory, a lot of writing, a lot of artifacts, artworks, and each one of these small sub-communities is trying to trace a history that has some outlook to the future. And so I find myself actually quite excited to be part of, let's call it 2 or 3 groups that are of 20, 30 people, that we mostly talk with each other online. There's some co-location of people where I've lived and the kind of circles I am present in. But it still is surprising to a lot of people outside of these circles that I meet people on Twitter, that I meet people online, that I meet people through forums, and that I would spend an afternoon writing 600 words to be sent off to 20 people for them to respond to me. And so this is a kind of funny state we are in right now where that is very normal blogosphere energy, and it's very normal kind of 1990s BBS, like origins of the internet culture, but it still retains an edge. And it feels very promising to me that it's in these spaces that some kind of future or vision of the future will happen. There's obviously this tension with the idea of a kind of mass movement, something that can actually enact change in the world, and the contrast with that with a small group of 30 people who have very particular words they use, they have internal slang. And so I think this tension is the kind of political question of our time. But the kind of pragmatic question, or the pragmatic state of it, is this kind of fracturing and isolation and new little communities being formed. One thing that's curious is the question of whether or not this is a return to some tribalism where everyone is isolated and everyone else is an enemy. But in that sense, I'm kind of optimistic. It feels to me that instead of operating in one tribe, you operate maybe in 4 of them, and they overlap with 4 others. There's a kind of hyper-distributed nature to people. I talk to people who live in Europe and Latin America and the US. I don't really talk much with people from Asia or Africa, but these are already diverse enough contexts where I'm talking to Americans, Brazilians, which are former colonies, and then we're talking here with people from ex-Yugoslavia. So these are 3 contexts which are already radically different enough. And so even though I operate within small networks of 20, 30 people, they are radically more diverse than this kind of pre-tribalism. So I'm optimistic that there's a kind of smallness that has this history that it can scavenge for, but that it won't kind of return to some, tribal barbaric past or something. Yeah. Yeah, so my background's in computer science. That's what I studied and was interested in studying. And I kind of approached it from, my original interest as a kid was in design, so I kind of approached this as a kind of space in which design happens, which is a kind of peculiar way to approach computer science. But it's interesting to think of it as the kind of medium or the meta-medium on which different mediums are expressed. And so if you think of the internet as one possible instantiation of an artifact on top of this substrate, which is internet protocols and computation as a process, interactive computer systems, the way I've been thinking about intervening in this space is something that our mutual friend Rob Oxshorn and I talk about, which is the idea of an existence proof. This is a kind of very natural idea in mathematics, but this is to counter-prove the idea of, if there's some assertion that this is always the case, to counter it, all you need to do is find one counterexample. And so in the computational sense, when you build alternative systems on top of a similar kind of substrate that has a lot of the same properties, so in the case of the internet, this is easy distribution, this is easy editing, this is interactivity, fastness, and lightness, but it has different smaller properties. And you produce artifacts that kind of elucidate this difference. So the goal really isn't to build the next very large platform which everyone will use. That's a kind of more startup entrepreneur mindset. It's more about showing that this kind of material, much how a sculptor thinks about marble or wood or something, this digital material, it has more possibilities in it. And so you just you do these gestures which are little proofs that, this could exist, or this could exist, or this could exist, and they kind of gesture to different futures. And you really can only do that if you have a familiarity with the material. This is the kind of banal but important assertion that an artist requires time and expertise in the medium they're using. In a kind of more concrete sense, there are in mathematics, one thinks about toy problems. These are problems which they're well-defined and small and scoped, and that you're able to, through them, explore certain ideas. And once they're, once this is proved out in this toy problem, you can then extrapolate that to different sources. And so the idea of, for example, Ubu being a toy archive or a toy artifact that has a well-defined scope. We have this amount of books. We have 2 teras or something of information that we need to push forward through time. It operates as a very fruitful constraint on which to try to think of this process forward. It's a lot easier constraint than to say, I want to build a generic infrastructure for communal relationships to archives. When you have one object and you need to do it concretely, it's kind of a very powerful direction forward. So in one sense, I see the kind of 25 years of Ubu in the future. When you think, the 50 Ubus, you can think of it kind of, again, metonymically as the idea of 50 different toy examples that are being pushed forward through time, and that out of one of those might come, from there, a kind of more mass instantiation of what the internet could be that has more political power and resonance in a kind of larger scale. So that's one dimension of it, is this kind of toy problem example. Of course, each one of these toy problems is shepherded by a small community. This community could be the custodians or the librarians, but if you're in a different field that isn't archiving, maybe you're thinking about audiovisual reproduction or stuff like this. I still think that is the unit that kind of will allow these 50 Ubus to exist. It's 20, 30 people, it's a small community, it's maybe a conference or 2 conferences, and overlapping ones, people who take part of Ubu, but also this kind of audiovisual example that I'm hypothetically coming up with, some small overlaps, and they kind of push these toy problems forward. I don't want with toy to imply banality or something. There's kind of really, I think every toy is, indicative of a serious problem to be done in the future, and there are just spaces in which one can play in a kind of less apocalyptic, less kind of impotent way, do something. But the hope is not that you'll, by reading enough, come up with the magical totalitarian system that, it explains it all and allows us to find something new. The hope is just that your trust is put in the process as opposed to the existence of the artifact, and you just, if you play with this and you keep on playing, you'll eventually stumble upon something compelling. I still haven't talked about. I feel like I still haven't talked far. Like, it's still kind of intermediate. So I want to think a little bit about what it would mean. Yeah, the question: what is 50 Ubus in 2046? I guess one thing that's interesting for me from the technical point of view is the idea of having more people who understand the digital medium as a substrate, as a material. Not as a kind of infrastructure or bureaucracy that you submit things to and then things happen, but as something that is kind of banal in many ways. And for me, this dimension is a kind of slightly more pedagogical or place where intervention can be done in a kind of more didactic way. But it's just trying to articulate these systems in simpler ways and finding simpler examples of them which do a lot of the same things. The big reference for me, of course, is Ivan Illich with his convivial tools, but just the idea that a 1980s car, which did not have electronic components, could be reassembled quite simply by a father and son, or if it breaks down on the side of the road. There are 3 or 4 things which are 90% of the problems, and that you can fix that. And nowadays, with kind of fully electric cars, with all of these conditions, it's very hard to do that. So then instead you call someone and you think of the car as something which you almost rent, in a sense. You may actually own it, but you rent your relationship to it because you do not have ownership over its maintenance and reliability. And so I'm very interested in having in 50 years after Ubu's origin, in 25 years, I guess 22 at this point, a kind of broader media literacy or digital literacy around what computation is. I still feel like people who know how to program are a little bit like medieval scribes. They're the only ones who know how to write and read, and that they have this kind of a Sisyphean task of just copying the things over to make sure we keep on going. But eventually, literacy came. And of course, this is Paulo Freire's big insight, but literacy is a lot easier when it's situated in a practice that you actually care about. And it's a lot harder when you're just saying to someone, like, let's program C.